The Syrian government was overthrown in December 2024 after more than a decade of war fueled by foreign powers, especially the United States. I did a previous video, which I will link to in the description below, in which I looked at a report in which Syrian rebels boasted that they were funded, armed, and trained by the US military, and that the Pentagon oversaw the offensive in which they overthrew the Syrian government of President Bashar al-Assad. The US military played a key role. But today I'm going to talk about another bombshell document that is from the 1980s that shows how the US government has been making plans for decades to try to overthrow the Syrian government, and it finally succeeded in 2024. I'm going to be looking at a declassified CIA cable from 1986 in which the notorious US spy agency, which has backed coups and regime change operations around the world, discussed potential scenarios for the overthrow of the Syrian government back in the 1980s, at the time when Syria was governed by the father of Bashar al-Assad, Hafez al-Assad. What is incredible about this document is you can see that basically everything that happened in the past decade, when the Syrian war broke out in 2011, and then the US, especially the CIA, spent billions of dollars arming and training rebels, many of whom were extremists linked to al-Qaeda. All of the operations that the US carried out in the 2010s had been discussed by the CIA 3 decades before. This is a declassified cable from the CIA from 1986 that is titled Syria Scenarios of Dramatic Political Change. And it outlines plans that the CIA had for potential ways to overthrow the Syrian government, which at that time was led by Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad. He was an Arab nationalist from the Ba'ath Party, which was a socialist-inspired Arab nationalist party. The CIA cable shows how the United States was exploiting religious tensions and sectarianism inside Syria, and the CIA was trying to portray the Syrian government as an Alawite minority government because the Assad family came from the Alawite branch of Shia Islam. So the US was trying to inflame tensions and supporting Sunni sectarians. And the CIA noted that the potential for serious communal violence remains, so they want to promote that violence. They noted that in the late 70s and early 80s, there were violent attacks by the Muslim Brotherhood, which it described as a Sunni fundamentalist organization. And the CIA cable from 1986 argued that outbreaks of Sunni dissidents might trigger large-scale unrest. Widespread violence among the populace could stimulate large numbers of Sunni officers and conscripts to desert or mutiny, setting the stage for civil war, which is exactly what happened in the 2010s, thanks to the US meddling in Syria, pushing the violent protests into a so-called civil war, which wasn't really civil because it was backed by the US and the Persian Gulf monarchies and Turkey and Israel. But the point is that this is a document that the CIA wrote in 1986 that made it clear that the US had this plan for many decades. The CIA cable complained about Syria's, quote, confrontation with Israel, end quote, and its, quote, close ties to the USSR, end quote. And the CIA said, quote, we judge that US interests in Syria probably would be best served by a Sunni regime, end quote, which is what it has now, with rebranded al-Qaeda in power. Of course, the vast majority of Sunnis on earth are not extremists. They don't support al-Qaeda, but the US just so happens to support these Sunni extremists across the region. In Syria, they did previously in Libya in 2011 when they overthrew the Libyan government and longtime anti-colonialist leader Muammar Gaddafi. So the US has this history of supporting these extremist Sunni groups. This CIA cable says that if there is a Sunni regime in Syria, the CIA calculated that such a Sunni regime would probably be less inclined to escalate tensions with Israel. So the CIA says, look, that would be better for us. They wouldn't fight against Israel, which is exactly what's happening now. Now that rebranded Al-Qaeda is in power, Julani, or Shara, with the support of the US, is saying we don't want any conflict with Israel. Unlike the Assad government, which was supporting resistance groups fighting against Israeli colonialism. Another interesting part of this CIA cable from 1986 is the US embassy acknowledged that at that time, President Hafez al-Assad, he had a strong position with Syria enjoying unprecedented stability and a high degree of grudging respect in the Arab world. So that's about the only positive words you're going to hear from the CIA, acknowledging that Syria was very stable and secure and was respected by other countries in the region, in no small part because Syria was helping to fight against Israeli colonialism backed by US imperialism. The US embassy also complained about the socialistic economic policies of the Syrian government under the Ba'ath Party. I'm reading here from the CIA cable from 1986. According to the US embassy, Assad's development programs have benefited rural areas at the expense of cities where Sunnis are concentrated, and the nationalization and formation of large industries have reduced the fortunes of Sunni tradesmen and business groups. Socialist economic reforms and an Islamic revival led to armed uprisings by the Muslim Brotherhood. So throughout this cable, what the CIA is admitting is that the Muslim Brotherhood consisted of the economic elites who were largely from the Sunni community, whereas the poor people in Syria were largely from the Alawite community, the Shia community. So the Syrian government, by nationalizing industry with these socialist policies, was helping reduce poverty and reduce inequality, which angered the Sunni capitalist oligarchs, the elites, and they funded and joined the Muslim Brotherhood to carry out violent attacks against the Syrian government. By the way, this is why it's not surprising that in December 2024, after these US-backed rebels overthrew the Assad government, they told Reuters that they want to have a free market economy. They pledge that they're going to have massive privatizations, they're going to cut social programs, they're going to overthrow all of the socialistic economic policies, the nationalist economic policies of the previous Ba'athist government, and instead they're going to implement neoliberal shock therapy like the US has always imposed after organizing coups and regime change operations, like it did in Russia in the 1990s. This is what these US-backed forces are going to do today, and this is what the CIA was talking about back in the 1980s. And this is why the US was supporting the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria in the 1980s as they carried out violent attacks to try to overthrow the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad. Going back to the CIA document, it noted that in the 80s, when the Muslim Brotherhood, with foreign support, not only from the US, but also from Turkey, when the Muslim Brotherhood launched these attacks to try to overthrow the Syrian government, they were viciously repressed. They were killed by the Syrian government. So in response to that, the CIA wrote, quote, "Although the Muslim Brotherhood's suppression drastically reduced armed dissidents, we judge a significant potential still exists for another Sunni opposition movement," end quote. And of course, it didn't happen until 2011, but when it did, the CIA was ready to activate. And then that's when the CIA launched Operation Timber Sycamore, spending billions of dollars funding these extremist groups. And then the CIA cable added that if there is a new Sunni challenge to the regime, then the US should get the support from the urban traders and artisans, that is the economic elites, quote, "who are disadvantaged by competition from state-run businesses and who were the prime constituency for the Muslim Brotherhood," end quote. So the CIA is admitting that they are not the working class. They are not the poor, oppressed people of Syria. They are the elites, the economic elites who lost their privileges when the Ba'ath Party came to power. The Arab nationalist government came to power, and it implemented these socialistic policies. So the economic elites, they joined the Muslim Brotherhood. And that's one of the main reasons that the US was backing them, just like today. And finally, at the end of this 28-page CIA document from 1986, the CIA wrote, again for emphasis in conclusion, quote, In our view, U.S. interests would be best served by a Sunni regime controlled by business-oriented moderates, end quote. They said that this sectarian Sunni regime, led by economic elites, would ask for Western aid and investment to build a private economy, not a socialist economy, and would have stronger ties with Western governments. They noted with enthusiasm that it would not be allied with the former Soviet Union or with Russia today. And of course, until the government was overthrown in December 2024, Syria was still a major Russian ally. And the CIA repeated that this sectarian Sunni regime would probably have better relations with Israel than the Ba'athist government had. So pretty much everything that the CIA predicted back in 1986 is exactly what happened to Syria in the past decade. Because this was the US plan the entire time. They never liked the Arab nationalist government in Syria that was originally created by Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, who was an Arab nationalist from the Ba'ath Party. The US was always looking for a way to overthrow the Syrian government because it was an ally of the former Soviet Union and the Russian Federation later, because it refused to recognize Israel, because it supported resistance against Israeli colonialism, and supported Palestinian national liberation movements and Lebanese nationalist movements defending their sovereignty, and because the Syrian government had a state-led economy with socialistic policies that would not allow US corporations and other Western corporations to simply do whatever they want in Syria to control the country. And now Syria is run by rebranded Al-Qaeda. The US State Department is sending top diplomats to meet with the former leader of Al-Qaeda to give their demands for ending the terror designation and lifting sanctions. And the US has won. The US military and the CIA spent over a decade arming and training these so-called rebels allied with Al-Qaeda, preparing for the moment when they could overthrow the Syrian government, and they have succeeded. But I've already spoken enough about this. I've done other analyses. I just wanted to provide this latest update based on more research that I've done. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I am Ben Norton, the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. Please like and please subscribe here so you can get access to more reporting we'll have in the future, more analysis as more information comes out. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I will see you all next time.